And yeah, but so that's just a disclaimer, setting the bar for myself pretty low.
You've got the pattern though. Yeah, you've made a great academic.
Okay, well, learn from the best. All right. So just to briefly go over what I did. So just in terms of the British people here, how many people have heard of Emmaus before? Have you heard the name Emmaus before? Okay, so that's okay. So what you may not, so if you know about Emmaus, you know that they provide shelter, accommodation, in addition to personal support and work retraining for people who have experienced homelessness and social exclusion. However, they're starting to diversify their operations in response to some challenges regarding how their funding model works, which we can get into later. Because of that, they're moving in a more social enterprise style direction and starting to become moving towards a more self-sustaining model that's less reliant on the receipt of housing benefit from the government through the people they house. So as part of this, they've decided to move into having operations which are separate from communities. So an Emmaus community is, So an Emmaus, just to briefly say, an Emmaus community is what they use to describe any area where they have a shelter. But they're moving into having operations which are separate from communities and aren't attached to those. And part of that is seeking out new opportunities to partner with other social enterprises to deliver both generation of profit for the main Emmaus UK organization to start new communities and sustain existing ones, but also to generate other social goods within that. So that's what I was doing. So the research question I undertook was, what are the factors determining effectiveness of long-term training program or job training program for long-term unemployed? Specifically, in this case, we were looking at youth unemployment in Tower Hamlets in London, which I will go into in a bit, why that's particularly important. However, some of the findings we found applied across the geographic and demographic groups we were looking at. So just to give you some brief facts about Emmaus, there are 25 communities across the UK. We are looking to have 30 by 2020 in terms of our strategic plan. We are opening a new one in Wales in November. We support 644 million homeless people. That number is actually slightly out of date now. We're about closer to 700. We aim to have 1,000 people housed by 2020. There are 240 volunteering opportunities with Emmaus. Again, that is slightly out of date. We're about closer to 300, and we want to move towards 500 non-housed volunteering opportunities within 2020. And we have 65 shops and social enterprises. So where I was located primarily was right here in London's East End. But I also visited Brighton, I also visited St. Albans, and I also visited a couple of places in Lambeth and Greenwich, which are in London as well. So the biggest thing about Emmaus's model, and something that I took to terming Housing First Plus, if you know what Housing First model is, it's basically an idea of how to deal with homelessness and get people on the road to recovery there. The main thing you want to do is provide housing as the first step, and then get people with all the social supports and things that they need in order to overcome whatever particular barriers that made them homeless in the first place, right? But the difference with Emmaus and what they add to that is the idea of providing meaningful work for people who are engaged in these social enterprises. So what does that mean? Well, it can mean anything, really. I saw from working at from going to different Emmaus communities, there were people engaged in all kinds of activities to sustain that community. Now, the really important thing was it was whatever the background and the interest of that particular person was there. So, for example, in Greenwich, one of the people who's the long-term companion there is somebody who used to work in a very high up position in IT. He had a lot of personal difficulties, ended up being homeless. He came into Emmaus, and now he runs all the IT operations within Greenwich there. So it's being able to recognize those unique values, those unique backgrounds, and those unique interests that people have that makes Emmaus very important. But usually the social enterprises that are connected to the community are charity shops which sell secondhand furniture, upcycled furniture, bric-a-brac clothing. There are also cafes, removal services, gardening projects. In terms of developing the new social enterprises in London's East End, we are planning to have 3 shops. They will be in Chingford, Poplar, where I worked, Chapel Market, and Wallington. All of those will be charity shops, but Chingford is going to have more of a focus on furniture upcycling. Okay, and this is also just some brief research that was done in terms of measuring the social impact of Emmaus. This was done in 2012. Basically, for every £1 that Emmaus spent, about 11 pounds of social benefit was generated from that. Basically, what that amounted to was an economic and environmental return, so benefits bill, healthcare, reduction in crime and reoffending, and a reduction in the amount of waste going to landfill. I thought that last one was particularly important to point out because a lot of the time when we talk about social enterprises, we don't think of the environmental impact that they can have even when it's not the primary focus. Okay. So what were the key desired outcomes in undertaking this new project expanding into the social enterprise sector that Emmaus was doing? So increased connection to community and build recognition for Emmaus. Emmaus is a relatively new entry into East London, particularly as Emmaus East London, which is not connected with any particular community. So I found particularly when I would go talk to people in the East London area, they didn't know really what Emmaus was. They weren't sure how it was different from other charity shops. They weren't sure what the uniqueness of the model was. So we want to build recognition. We want to expand and stabilize the retail operations to make greater charitable contributions to the overall organization. So basically, we want to have a better revenue stream because we know that some of our government funding isn't going to be there in the future. We also want to increase social awareness of homelessness and other support areas in which Emmaus works. This is about the whole conception of Emmaus has of an idea called solidarity, which basically meaning even if you are in a perhaps not great social position, you still have the ability to work to improve the lives of others. The people who we are trying to sort of incorporate into volunteering and working with Emmaus in the East End have their own social difficulties, but we'd like them to be able to see that even though they have those social difficulties, they can help people who might be worse off than them or might have other difficulties than they do. And the other thing was we wanted to develop a unique organizational profile. We don't want to be just another charity shop. Charity shops in the UK are about 10 pence a dozen, to coin a cross-cultural phrase. Therefore, we want to have a unique organizational profile. The way we want to focus on that is making sure that people who come through Emmaus get a really holistic training program which prepares them to move into retail management and improves interpersonal skills, improves their ability to relate to other people, and also incorporating a furniture upcycling aspect. And also advancing the non-companion engagement training. This is the shop where I worked. Don't know why that was. All right. All right. You get what you get. All right. So the organization that we decided to partner with in advancing this training project was called Streets of Growth. Streets of Growth was founded in 2001. It works primarily in the Tower Hamlets area. It does go a little bit outside of that into Waltham Forest, Haringey a little bit. But primarily Tower Hamlets based. Deals with youth unemployment, not in education, employment training, related issues, job training, coaching, personal skills development. They have a lot of organic sort of connections to the local social economy and also local employers, so we felt that they were a really good choice to move into with this. And the emphasis they have is borough restoration within a social enterprise context. Let me just kind of go into what that means. Basically, the idea being that they want to really connect the youth of that area with the regeneration and regrowth of Tower Hamlets. As I'll go into in a minute, there are a lot of different social issues there. But there's particularly an emphasis on allowing youth to experience enterprise and particularly being able to connect them with social enterprise sorts of goals. They've assisted about 1,500 young persons. They maintain an active roster of around 75 young persons. It's not on here, but the age range we're talking about here is 13 to primarily 19. They do have some cases where people will stay on with them for a bit of additional coaching as they move into their 20s, but generally speaking, we're talking about that. So this is Darren and Diane and Jasper, who are three of the people who I worked with at Streets of Growth. Darren and Diane, the two older people, there are the founders. So one of the main reason we decided to engage with Streets of Growth was they have this project called Turning the Tables, which what that is a specifically furniture restoration focused project. So they are able to get in like old pieces of furniture, things that people don't really want anymore. They bring them in and they work with some of the students there they've worked with to restore this furniture. And the idea is that by restoring this furniture, it's kind of in a sense a metaphor for restoring yourself and restoring your ability to connect with the community. And the other thing they do within that context is they say, okay, you've restored this furniture now, and what they do some really interesting pieces in terms of like artistically designing it and things like this. And when they do that, they also say, okay, now go out and sell it. So they help them with selling it on eBay, selling it on eBay or through other channels like that, but really designing a story around it and shaping that. But one of the things now is they want to get some of their pieces into the Emmaus shops. So that's sort of how this came around. This is another project they did. This was with HSBC. That was mainly about the students there worked on different pieces of art, and then again, they had to actually sell that to HSBC, had some of their people come in and, okay, tell me about your art. What does it represent? What does it mean to you? And they would actually get to keep the money that the HSBC people paid for it. This is something I worked on with them. This is them being taught skills in how to repair mobile phones and things like that, because they identified something as, the challenge was to design and create your own business. So what the young people decided to do in this case was start a business repairing mobile phones, because that's a really big problem, people dropping their phones. I know I did that over the summer. So that was something they decided that would be a good idea to do, and that's them being shown how to do it. What were their key desired outcomes? They want to increase social interest in social enterprise within Tower Hamlets. There are a lot of different charitable organizations working in Tower Hamlets, but the social enterprise economy there, as, quote, social enterprise, is a bit underdeveloped, so they want to kind of have more recognition for that term, what it actually means, and get some more people, particularly young people, interested in it. And develop a basis for further employment-based partnerships. One of the big problems with Streets of Growth is they do give people a lot of this really great training, but the issue is sometimes the connection to the job pipeline isn't necessarily there. So we wanted to get them into a situation where they could come into Emmaus, get some of that practical work experience, and then move on into either further paid employment with us or another organization. Okay, so how was the research I did conducted? Your standard governmental statistical data, literature review of previous work employment programs. We did some case study reviews. But the main important things were the interviews with the organizational staff, the clients, companions with Emmaus. And we did some really good focus groups with both the target demographics, so young people in the area, and also with local businesses to figure out, okay, if we're giving people this training, are you going to actually be able to, are you going to actually hire them, and what do you need to see up from our end to get these people into some more secure and stable employment? So just to briefly review some previous findings about employment training programs. So basically, employment training is most effective when it's individualized. You have to be able to harness those individual talents and interests that people have. The broad-based programs tend to have limited effectiveness and pretty large drop-off numbers. You can see that if you've looked at any statistical review with the current government's strategies, let's say, for tackling long-term unemployment. They haven't been very effective because it's very broadly based. Like, here's how you write a CV. Here's how you write a cover letter. Have you tried searching this sort of database for jobs? It doesn't really work all that well. Voluntary training programs work better than mandatory. So basically, if you force somebody to do something, they're not really going to want to do it, and they're not going to engage with it properly. That's, again, about trying to shape what people are doing based on what they're actually interested in. And the other thing is training should provide clear pathways to sustained employment. So the idea being that if you go through this training, you have to be able to reasonably promise somebody an outcome that's going to be productive for them at the end of it, because people just don't want to go through all this training for nothing. Okay. Social context, Tower Hamlets. So Tower Hamlets, it has the highest child poverty rate in the UK by borough, has a very disproportionately young population, which of course means that as we move forward in time, these people are going to be in the prime working age demographic. So we have to start addressing some of these problems now in order to have a properly prepared workforce for the future. The 16 to 24 unemployment rate is 24%. That's the latest figures. And a high number of people in the borough lack any sort of formal qualifications. And the other thing was there were large skill gaps seen by area employers, particularly in areas of interpersonal skills. About 50% of all employers within the area said that the people that were coming into their jobs and applying really did not have good interpersonal skills. Another was leadership and time management skills were seen as particularly lacking. So just to give you an idea of what Tower Hamlets is like, I'm going to show you two pictures. This is Canary Wharf, which is a very, very rich area in Tower Hamlets. I had to walk by here every day, and there were a lot of people in very nice suits, and I felt very inadequate. And this is where I worked. I actually took this standing on the balcony of a council flat because I was helping them do a furniture clearance to get an idea of the operations. As you can see, I mean, it's actually a pretty nice street market they have there, but you can see the kind of older council housing. People are kind of bustling around. So it's a very divided area in terms of demographics and then also by income. So existing training opportunities, what's available already? So there are two different kinds of things. There are traineeships and apprenticeships. The traineeships are usually short, they're unpaid. The idea behind them is to give people a taster of particular field work. The problem, as we found later, was that people don't generally recognize this as any sort of a qualification from our employer's perspective, and therefore the people who we did focus groups with thought they were useless and pointless because of that. Apprenticeships are longer term, they're paid, as Tyler was talking about, and they lead to an MBQ in a particular area of work. However, they are long-term, and the pay rate is substantially lower than minimum wage. And the other thing is that a lot of the clients we were working with weren't ready for this type of long-term commitment and also lacking personal supports. So, yeah, the key points of the focus group, what did people need out of a job training program? So they needed realistic work experience, possibility of a CV reference. A lot of these people who we were working with hadn't had any work experience before, so they don't have a reference when they go into another job. Understanding and flexibility in part of employers for life circumstances. A lot of the people we work with deal with things like drug addiction, family difficulties, all kinds of things ranging from A to Z. They needed some degree of flexibility and understanding from employers about those sorts of issues, so that if, for example, they missed a couple of days, it wouldn't be completely falling off the wagon, and there were abilities to reintroduce them to the job training programs. Supported finding a job after the program completed. A lot of people had gone through previous training programs, but they felt that they were just dropped off at the end, and that they weren't really given effective access to continuing supports. And yeah, there were also some other things, accessibility of workplaces. That's both in terms of disability areas, but then also physically in terms of transportation. A lot of people we were working with they basically couldn't even afford a regular fare on the tube or things like that. So we would have to give them that if they wanted to move between the areas. And then the other thing was just in talking to them, there were a lot of barriers that are created by government programs. So what I mean by that is the way that particularly the benefit system is moving, where you have to continually sign on, where there's a lot of, we've noticed particularly with young people in Tower Hamlets, there's a lot more benefit sanctions being applied to people for very minor reasons. So they felt that this was really more of a hindrance than it was a help. Okay. So this is just an example of one of the focus groups I did. That's two of the facilitators just talking to the group that I worked with before I talked to them. Okay, so out of this, we sort of thought about, okay, what's a general program theory we can say that comes out of all of this? So basically, that's what we came up with, was the idea that the key reason that a lot of these job training programs are ineffective with those furthest from the labor market is that they lack additional supports outside of the direct training to build personal resiliency, to build the ability to keep applying for things, to keep going into different places, and also to build those interpersonal skills that I talked about. And the idea being that resilient persons will be able to sustain employment in a long-term fashion. Chad talked to you earlier about how important resilience is in an organizational context, but it's also really important in an individual context. So out of that, what were our activities in the course? So basically what we came up with was a BTEC work skills training course. So that's basically the equivalent of a BTEC level 3 is the equivalent of a GCSE, but BTEC level 2 is slightly below that, but a lot of people don't have any sort of formal qualifications. We were also very fortunate to be able to have a partnership with East London Business Alliance and they are a local charitable organization that's made up of all the larger businesses within East London, but send representatives to it. But what they do is skills building workshops, and they also facilitate training and development programs within their own organizations. Retail work experience with Emmaus, furniture upcycling workshops, and then support with the continuing employment search. But then the other key thing was that coaching and ongoing personal support. That's something that Emmaus internally is really able to provide because people are actually living with them. The idea was to somewhat be able to recreate that as we move into more attempting to address outside people. How are we going to still be able to have those kinds of support? So it was good to have Streets of Growth as that outside organization coming in to help us with that. That you can't really see too well, but that's a kind of general theory of how this all works. Whatever. I promise that looks better when it's printed out, but it didn't really show up too well. So what were the benefits of collaborating between these two organizations? So one of the biggest things was the ability to harness each organization's unique strengths and their unique expertise areas. Basically, the idea being that, Streets of Growth is good at certain things. They understand the area better. They understand Tower Hamlets as a demographic and social group a lot better than Emmaus does. But Emmaus has more experience developing that kind of practical work experience and also working with people who have been socially excluded. So how can we bring those hands together? Build interest in social enterprise and awareness of social issues in young persons. Again, that comes back to that Emmaus conception of solidarity. The idea being that you can do something useful with your time that's going to be able to impact people who also experience similar issues or different issues to you. And the other thing was we wanted to bring more cohesion to the social economy of the area. There are a lot of charitable initiatives and a lot of different things going on in Tower Hamlets, but what I found in doing this was a lot of them just were not talking to one another. There was a lot of program overlap. There were a lot of things that were discoordinated. There were a lot of things where multiple organizations were trying to address the same issue in almost the exact same way, and it was almost like nobody had ever talked to each other before I came in there and really started doing that. And then addressing new client demographics. So the biggest challenges here in terms of creating this collaboration were coordinating these training activities with the social enterprise operations generally. So what I mean by that is Emmaus needs to run a solid retail operation in order to keep the funding going, right? Similar to what Morgan was talking about, people aren't going to come into our shops just because we're Emmaus and we do all these great things. They want decent quality products, they want a good price point, and they want a pleasant customer service environment, right? So because of all of that, it can be difficult to incorporate these other kinds of goals with the idea of generating the revenue to feed it back into the Emmaus overall organization. So that was a big challenge we came across. Working across organization, traditional different areas of focus and work style. Basically that meaning Emmaus's work style and the people that work there, particularly in the retail operations, is more, as I say, retail and business focused, whereas Streets of Growth is more about personal development, and kind of that intensive one-on-one work with individual young persons. So the work styles and even the sort of ethos values between the two organizations, from what I saw, were quite a bit different. So it took a lot of work to try and bring them together on those points. I think we got there in the end. Exporting models to different demographic groups. So one of the big things was mainly the people who come into Emmaus communities tend to be older than obviously older than the young persons that Streets of Growth work with, but they disproportionately, even within the homeless population, they're a bit older. They tend to be more male. They tend to be more from white British demographics as opposed to other demographics. So that's not to say that's all of them, but it's disproportionate. So there are always sort of issues when you start moving between demographic groups. Are things going to apply? And then the other thing was developing a system of data inputs. As Tyler talked about, this is really difficult figuring out what exactly you want to measure coming out of this. And again, working between two organizations, they had different ideas about what the key social indicators were. In the end, we ended up having a pretty complex sort of grid architecture, which I won't bother showing you because it only makes sense internally, really. and it ended up having about 20 different outputs and outcomes on it. And that was mainly because Emmaus wanted to measure certain things, Streets of Growth wanted to measure certain things, kind of had to throw it together. Yeah, limitations. So basically the area covered in terms of areas and focus groups, it was limited to Tower Hamlets. I went a little bit beyond that because, you're in boroughs, people do cross lines. It's not like there are, border guards between these places. But how applicable this might be to other areas, it's questionable. Certain demographic groups were overrepresented, underrepresented. So again, as I talked about, difficulty in tracking long-term outcomes. So one of the biggest things was if we want to move people into sustained long-term employment, we want to make sure that they're continuing to be employed or continuing to be involved in education and training activities over 6 months, over a year, over 2 years, over 3 years. But the problem is people who are socially vulnerable and moving between these different places tend not to stay put in a lot of ways, or tend not to be able to be reached. Their phone might get shut off, or they might not have access to a computer, things like that. So that's one of the big challenges, is figuring out where exactly people go at the end of it. Streets of Growth has a little more success with that because they tend to develop pretty close personal relationships between the coaches and the young people they work with. So young people, for example, will come back into Streets of Growth to talk about what they've gone on to do. But there are difficulties there. And then the specific program impacts, the program is still being implemented. It's still going through the process. So we have a tracking system. We have all these things to do. And we know what our general impacts are, but we don't know what the specific impacts of this program in particular will be. So personal reflections that I had. There's a difference of approaches to the social problem of homelessness between the countries. So I've worked in homeless shelters and with social service organizations in Canada, and the big thing I found was two things. The first is that in the UK there is way more of an emphasis on getting people into housing faster, I found. In Canada, we're still trying to move towards that housing first model, but we're still kind of stuck in the old model, which is continuity of care, which is basically the idea of certain people can't really effectively move into housing, so we need to treat them for these other things before we do that. We can disagree or talk about this, but I don't really think that's an effective model. So I think that was the first thing. The second thing was even in situations where you have housing options in Canada, we don't really provide a lot of outside engagement and opportunities within that organization. So the homelessness organization will really just be, we're going to give you a bed, we're going to give you some food, but if you want to engage with these other activities, we might recommend you to this organization, but we're not going to deliver it internally. There's more of a process of internal delivery from what I've seen. Another really important thing was giving a name, a face, and a story to the issues. The biggest thing we found in terms of trying to pitch this to funders, because we needed some startup capital, was that it was much more effective to have somebody who had worked with Streets of Growth come in with us if they were willing to and talk about their story and describe what Streets of Growth had really done for them, to give a kind of concrete picture of what the applications were. Business planning is becoming key for this sector. That's why we had that kind of weird, elaborate, flow chart thing. That was because basically our funders wanted that. They wanted a key way of understanding exactly what the inputs were, what the outputs were. And yeah, with some recent controversies in the news surrounding particular nonprofit organizations, I think business planning for this sector is going to become more and more relevant. And also, I never worked with youth before. My experience tended to be with older people in terms of disability support, income support, and again with homelessness. So it was interesting to see the idea of trying to stop problems before they get worse. A lot of what we kind of ended up talking about between Streets of Growth and Emmaus is that the people who Streets of Growth are helping now might be the people that Emmaus would end up having to help, 10 years, 20 years down the line if we weren't intervening earlier. So that was an interesting thing. Oh yeah, so yeah, this is me coming into the country. I don't get recourse to public funds, sadly. This is me saying, so I had to. This was a pilgrimage I had to make while I was in London. But just to talk, just to say that like I really did have a personal impact on me being here, and that was probably the biggest takeaway I had from the whole experience, courtesy of the Imperial War Museum. So what are some key conclusions I drew from this whole experience? The biggest thing was we need to act locally but think wider. So basically that meaning you have to adapt to what the local conditions are, what the local demands of the demographic groups you're working with are. But we also need to think about how we can move the models that we're using between different organizations, between different areas. One of the biggest things that Emmaus is trying to do over its strategic plan for 2020 is more information sharing between the branches. The problem right now is that it's a very federalized sort of system, meaning that there's not a lot of information sharing in a central hub going on. We want to start to break those barriers down. So we're thinking if this program proves to be successful, it can be a model for non-companion engagement by other branches and bodies within Emmaus. You have to adapt to market conditions in terms of what you're looking at for the employment training you're actually giving to people. We don't want to give people training that isn't going to move them into a sustainable job path. So the reason we settled on retail and furniture upcycling was both of those are growth sectors within Tower Hamlets. There's a lot of, retail is always something that's growing, but it's particularly growing in terms of people who have really good retail management skills. And then furniture upcycling is becoming a much bigger thing in London because of the sustainability impacts that it has. Individualized programming is key. Use the talents we already have. Supports are necessary to address those personal barriers. So without those supports, you often get people dropping off of programs, backsliding, having relapses, and not really being able to successfully complete things. Formal qualifications are increasingly necessary, whether we like it or not. If you don't have an NVQ or a BTEC or just some sort of piece of paper with your name on it, employers aren't really going to think twice about you, to be quite frank about it anymore. And the biggest thing coming out of all of this was giving people a purpose and making a connection. You have to make the work meaningful for people, both in a personal sense and in a wider social sense. Emmaus used to have a slogan, which they dropped, which was, we give people a bed and a reason to get out of it. They kind of dropped that because there were some connotations to it, but it's still an interesting way of kind of thinking about the whole sort of model. Okay, and yeah, that was just kind of my final concluding thought, is that you never actually get that far from home in the end, because this was a place in London. Okay, are there particular questions? Yes?
The project I do in the East Riding of Yorkshire embraces all the activities that you've mentioned. The difference is that we're in a rural area.
Okay.
And I think the difference between the urban and the rural is huge. On mobility, on spread of employers, on industry options, hell of a difference that isn't recognised at all by the government. And speaking of which, I think the DWP could help you with stories of people and what they do. Very short of it. But DWP are not always helpful to us.
No.
The way they let their contracts are a disgrace. And I don't know if it will ever change. With your core organisation, where did your income streams? Where are your income
Okay,
streams?
where are income streams? Okay. So we make, I think, just to first of all address all of what you're saying, I basically agree with everything you're saying as far as the DWP. We don't receive funding through them dedicated. The only funding we receive from the government is people have to sign off their individual housing benefit to us, only housing benefit, nothing else. If you come into an Emmaus community, you're off all other benefits. We only ask you to use a housing benefit because we are housing you, and we receive that through a dedication.
Yeah.
That is about 40% of our funding currently. That's according to the last estimate. However, we see that shrinking to about 30% of our funding, and that's why we have to develop more of these models because with the recent cuts to housing benefit and the way the delivery is going to be changed, we're planning for that. 60% of our funding is self-generated and moving up to 70%. So that comes from sales of furniture, bric-a-brac, clothing through our stores, our cafes, everything else like that. That's where that comes from. The rest of the final 10% is made up of one-off grants from private organizations to develop specific new projects. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Again, fantastic presentation. I'm absolutely gobsmacked at how much you guys have managed to do in 10 weeks. I think my question was kind of about Emmaus, but more generally, Rora and I know Emmaus through Alex Murdoch, who's one of the people.
Yeah. No, good guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. But
Yeah.
This and many organisations, it seems to me, are focusing on a push model for employment. So you take young unemployed people or homeless people, you train them up and push them towards the marketplace. So the client is the homeless person or the NEET.
Yeah.
I wonder whether there's any merit in Emmaus looking at the employers as being the clients as a pull.
So
actually providing services directly to employers to pull people closer to the marketplace.
Okay, so kind of in a capacity of saying, we would develop some kind of contract or some kind of agreement with a particular employer which says, okay, we're going to do it, this is a bad way of saying it, but we're going to have you X amount of people trained, ready to go in your organization. Okay, so we did talk to some employers in the East End about whether that would be a viable model. They basically said to us, we would consider it if you want to become that more training-focused organization. They said they would consider it, but the issue was they needed to have a proven track record that we could actually effectively train people beforehand. Because the thing is, with Emmaus is actually quite unique in terms of the actual communities because people actually stay there pretty long-term, most of them, right? Like, most of the guys who are there who are older, as I'm sure you know if you've looked at, are probably going to live the rest of their lives there, or at least until they have to move into some kind of more assisted care kind of situation. So it fits a particular kind of model, and a lot of the guys, for example, I went up to St. Albans and I talked to people there because they wanted to move their training in a more NVQ-focused direction, the management did. But they talked to the companions there, and they felt very threatened by it. They thought, why do we need this? We have internal training. We're doing just fine here. Why do we need these things? So I think it's I think it's a kind of one of those disconnects between like the Emmaus companion demographic profile versus the demographic profile we were trying to hit in Tower Hamlets. But it's definitely something we've looked at. The issue was they basically they basically said prove that you can do it to us, and then they consider it. Further questions?
A provocative question.
Okay.
In 1834, when the poor laws were reformed, state benefits were cut, we had the rise of the workhouse.
Yeah.
What will stop this becoming the modern workhouse?
Okay. Okay. No, I mean that's a very provocative and fair question. That's something that I asked. Because you come into it and you think you're making people work. Like, isn't this not really? So, what I would say to that is first of all, anybody who has an intimate history of how the poor laws work, know that workhouses were just awful. They were intentionally awful in terms of the way they treated people, right? So that's the first thing. Is I don't think, just in terms of the support that they give people, in terms of the way that they engage with the people, that Emmaus is like that at all. The background of it is very different. The second thing is that if you go to an Emmaus community, it's very interesting because the paid staff who are there and the companions are very much on the same level in terms of the operations that they do, in terms of what they're actually doing in the store, all that. there is not really a differentiation between the two groups in terms of the way that they interact with each other, at least from my work experience there and from what I saw going to the different communities. Now, federal may differ between communities, but at least from what I saw. So that would be the first thing. The third thing, I suppose, is that, it is about getting that meaning into people's lives, and a lot of people who came into Emmaus really did feel that the way they delivered the work was done in such a way that it added a meaning and a reason for them to, it added something for them to do during the day. And they said, the issue with these other homeless shelters is that you would go in at night, but then what do you do during the day, So I definitely think it's a fair point, and I definitely don't think that anybody should ever be forced into a situation where that's what they would need to do. The thing is that Emmaus in terms of the client profile, or the companion profile, attracts a very particular sort of person who is able to go through that. And, you're free to leave at any time through that, and they will assist you with other housing options if that is something that you need. There are certain groups who don't work well there. Generally, they find it's older people who tend to adapt better to it, and people who have some more work experience in their background. It's not really the younger kind of point. But I take your point. It's definitely something that I would say this. I don't think Emmaus would work if it wasn't based on that idea that you're coming into it voluntarily, or that you've been recommended to it. And it's definitely not something I would ever recommend, like a government program, to move towards.
We could probably squeeze in one more question, if anyone has a final question.
Yeah.
What's one personal victory that you're going to take away from this wealth of experience that you'll likely bring to your next endeavor?
I think the biggest thing that I'll take to my next personal endeavor is the idea that you've got to collaborate between different organizations to get the right thing happening, because too often, as people were considering earlier, too often people work in silos and they're not talking to each other. I wish in previous organizations that I had worked at that had addressed homelessness, I now wish that I had talked to outside organizations to connect people there with services better, and tried to figure out, how we could have done that. And if I ever work in that sector again, which I figure I probably will at some point, I'll definitely move towards that direction, because I think that's what's going to be necessary moving forward, at least until you have some kind of coordinated response between them.